All right, folks, today we're going to talk about some data. We're going to look at some tables, talk about the variables and how things are organized in tables, how we can read them very clearly and very accurately. Okay, if you missed today, we did cover the syllabus, and you can get that and ask me any questions that you did have over it. Okay, but to get started here, make sure you have the practice worksheet for day 1 class, and also make sure you have the homework, because we're going to start out with some definitions to get us going here, and if you write them down as we go, that saves you a step on your homework. Okay. Another thing that will be helpful for today is a calculator, so make sure you have one handy. Let's go ahead and get started. I said we're going to start with some vocab here. It doesn't make sense to jump right into questions if there's some words in there that you really don't know what they mean. So we're going to start out with some vocab that relates to statistics. It's a word you've heard before. Let's talk about its specific definition here. There's 2 ways that the word statistics is actually used for us. The first one is the class. You know, you take a stats class, so it's the science of collection, organization, analysis, and how we interpret data, which is a little bit of what we're going to be doing today. But it's also used for a specific number. So it says used to describe a set of numbers, the mean, the median, the mode. Those are things you're probably familiar with. We're going to look at different statistics this chapter that maybe you're not as familiar with as well. Data is the plural datum, even though you don't see that word very often. When we talk about data, it's plural because we usually don't look at just one piece of information. So if you're looking at the mean, that's specifically that would be actually a piece of datum, not data. Then variable. This is how we organize things often. It's a characteristic of a person or thing that can be classified, counted, ordered, or measured. Okay, so gender, religion, height, weight, eye color, lots of different things that we can classify or count. Okay, variables. Other things that we'll need to look at, and if you need to pause the video to get those jotted down on your homework, feel free. Okay, but I'm going to move on to these next ones. Sample. We sample things a lot. We sample food. We take a little piece of the larger chunk that we're looking at. It's just a subset or a smaller portion of the population or the whole group. Okay, so if you need to make yourself a little note here, your population is your whole group. A survey is a lot of times the way that we get the information that we're gathering. So it's gathering facts or opinions through an interview or questionnaire. Opinions generally aren't useful in some studies, but a lot of times businesses will gather survey of opinions to see how they're doing and how they can improve things. So they're useful sometimes. A census, hopefully you've heard that word in terms of the U.S. Census, but actually the word census is more broad than that. It's just a survey of the entire population, no matter what that population means. So the word here, population, is not talking necessarily about the count of humans that you have. It's whatever the group you're studying is. So anytime you take the whole population, you're actually taking a census instead of a sample. A representative sample. This is the best way we can take a group. We want to make sure we're choosing a group that has the same characteristics of the population. So it wouldn't make sense if we were trying to gather data on say students in the high school here. We wouldn't take a sample of just like the FST class, because not everybody takes FST. So that wouldn't really be representative of the whole school. We want to make sure we're sampling from all different facets and subgroups that we can to make it as accurate of information as possible. So now that we know a little bit about the words we're going to be using, we're going to look at this table. It says in Boston, 2,145 selected inline skaters were chosen for a survey, and they were asked to classify their ability as beginner, average, or advanced. And then they were asked also whether they wore protective gear, like helmets, knee pads, shin pads, elbow pads, all that good stuff. Then they organized it in a table. Anytime you're looking at kind of two different things you're measuring, here the gear you're wearing and also the skill level, it's good to organize it in a table so you have really clear groupings of what goes with what. It's easier to read than just looking at the raw pieces of data. So, the first question we have, it says, are the data based on a sample or the entire population? So when we're trying to think about this, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the population? You know, who are we trying to gather this data about? So if we're thinking about this amount of protective gear and the skill level, you would think we're talking about, you know, the skaters. But specifically, you know, we need to know, are we looking at regular skaters? This one specifically says inline skaters, so that's important. But also, they're looking at just Boston. And we have to ask ourselves, do you think that Boston is the group we're looking at, or all of the inline skaters in the whole world? So that's kind of a way I would start always when you're asked about the sample or population, is think about who the whole group is. But there are some keywords that help you identify a sample really obviously. And the one that's here in this example is this selected. Okay, anytime you see the word chosen, selected, picked out of a group, that's going to be a huge indicator that this is actually a sample. They didn't choose all of the skaters in Boston even. They chose just this many of them. Okay, so we're going to say sample. And the biggest indicator is that word selected. If you can look for things like that, that'll help you on your homework determine which one is which. Okay? What variables are presented? So if you go back to your definitions, a variable, remember, is something that you can count or classify. Okay, often, folks, these show up in your headings on your table. Okay, so let's talk about the pieces of the table. So your headings are going to be at the top and over to the side. Okay, going down, we have the columns. So this is actually a column heading. And over on this side is our rows. So this is our row heading. And that often will give you everything you need to know about variables. I'll go ahead and label these. So for us, we've got two. We've got the skill level, and we've got the amount of protective gear worn. So questions like that, check out your headings, and it's going to take care of that for you. Next up, it says, what percent of skaters wore no gear? So with this, we kind of have to understand how we think about percents and how we read the table given those rows and columns. So first thing you want to think about with a percent is we always take some number, whatever it's asking us about, and put it over the total. So there's two pieces that make it. So what I'm going to have you actually do is look for the word of, because the word of often indicates the total for you. So it says of skaters. So that means that this guy is going to be our total. So we have to find somewhere in the table where it gives us the total number of the skaters here. So for us, we've actually got total columns here, and let's talk about how these are interpreted. So this total, 709, is talking about the total number of beginners. This 682 is the total number of average. The 754 is the total advanced. This one down here, very similar. This is the total as you go down of people who wore no gear, total who wore one piece of gear, and those who wore 2 to 4. Okay, so for us, it's just in skaters in general. It doesn't say beginner skaters. It doesn't say skaters who wore no gear. It's just skaters. So that is all of those ones who were chosen. So 2,145. Now, of those, we're going to look at the top number. That always comes next. After this of, it'll tell you specifically who are we looking at. So it says for us, no gear. So we want to look at all of the people who wore no gear. Again, it doesn't say beginners who wore no gear, just everybody. So that means this would count, this would count, this would count. All of those are involved in the no gear column. Luckily for us, it's already totaled, so we don't have to work that hard. I told you you wanted to have your calculator handy. We want to write this as a percent, so go ahead and type that in there for me, and then we'll move the decimal over 2 places. In general, when we're asked about percentages, if any percentage is represented in the table already, we want to round to that same value. Otherwise, it'll tell you what to round to, or we're just going to pick a random decimal to round to. Okay? Let's go ahead and round all these to 2 places because there's no percents represented here, and it doesn't give us directions on what to round to. So that would look like for us 40.75%. So a good chunk, almost half there. All right. Let's try the next one. It says what percent again, so we have to have some sort of fraction. And remember, the total comes after the word of. So, of beginners. So, beginners is what's going to go on bottom here. So, we need to find all of the beginners. Again, remember, beginners here, this row, all of them is 709. So, that goes on the bottom. The next thing we see will tell us what we need to go with here. So now what's really important to realize here, if we're only looking at beginners, that means only these guys, oh, my highlighter stopped working, only these guys count. Because if you go in and add all of these other ones, we're going to get a number that's larger than 709, and that doesn't really make sense. We know 100% is the largest percent we can have. So we want to make sure we're only focusing on beginners. But then it says we're looking at no gear beginners, which is right there at 188. Anytime you have a number larger than the bottom, go back and rework it because something went wrong there. Again, type that in. Let's just do 2 decimals like the last time. And that's 26.52%. Alright, next up it just says a how many. So this is going to be a flat number rather than a percent, but it says how many skaters said they were advanced. Okay, see if you can figure out where that goes in the table. Okay, how many skaters said they were advanced? So first thing we know is advanced, and it just says how many. Well, this 372 is advanced, but so is this 242, so is this 140. We want the total value. So it's 754. Let's make sure we get a label on there, skaters. Okay. The next one talks about advanced skaters as well. We're already in that row right there, but it says how many advanced skaters wore protective gear. Okay, so if they're wearing gear, they can't be this guy, because that's no gear. But it could be 1 piece, or it could be this 2 to 4 pieces. So what we're going to do is just add those together, because they both work, to get our total. Again, we want to tack on a label. Now, this table, it's pretty easy to add those 2 up. Sometimes we get into larger tables that have a lot more rows, a lot more columns, and it's actually easier to work backwards. Here's what I mean by that. We could have taken this 242 and 140 to get 382, but if we want to say they wore protective gear, that means they didn't not wear gear. I know that's a double negative, it sounds weird, but you can take the total, 754, and take off those who don't count. We said that 372 doesn't count, and that gives you that same value. Again, here it's easier to just add, I think, but with more data, sometimes it's faster to subtract than have to add a bunch of different values. Okay, so keep that in mind when you go through your homework here. Now, we've talked about variables, specifically these last ones. We talked skill level and amount of protective gear worn. These variables can be classified into one of two types, a categorical variable and a numerical variable. Now, kind of what it sounds like, category, a categorical variable, it just categorizes into a specific grouping. It says it doesn't correspond to specific numbers. So if you were talking about like your hair color, well, that's brown, blonde, red. Okay, those aren't numbers. Where a numerical variable like height or weight are represented by numbers. So if we go back to our skill level and our amount of protective gear worn here, that was question A, I think? No, B. These are both categories. And let me explain why. So skill level, it should be obvious to you. You're a beginner, you're average, and advanced. That's not classified by number. But I want to talk about why the amount of protective gear worn is also categorical, even though we're talking about numbers, 0, 1, 2 to 4. Anytime your data is classified by an interval, so it's not saying 0, 1, 2, 3, but it's like 2 to 4 pieces. Anytime they're grouping things together, it's going to actually be categorical. And that's because we can't actually determine in that group of 227 people how many people actually had 2 pieces, how many had 4 pieces, how many had 3 pieces. We just know about the whole group. And in general, kind of like what it says in this definition here, right, if you can't calculate a specific statistics like the mean, then we can't really call it numerical. Okay, so anytime you see an interval, remind yourself that actually is a categorical variable rather than numerical. Kind of putting all this together before we go to the next example is what variables are presented how. Remember, look at your row and column headings. It's the easiest indicator of where to find those. Okay, we haven't talked about this yet. It says, how do we know that the table we just looked at was actually trustworthy? In order to determine that, you want to look for a source. So here, a lot of times with a table, you'll see it at the bottom, but sometimes it's also given in the beginning information. It said here the people were selected from or for a survey. It doesn't really give us a whole lot other than there was this survey. So we don't necessarily know that this is a trustworthy table of data because, you know, there's always the chance that someone could lie. It's like, yeah, I wear a helmet when they really don't. You know, with surveys like that, they're self-reporting that. And we're going to talk a little bit about reliable data and some biases that occur in sampling methods next class. Okay, so we'll get more into that. But look for a source, but also make sure it's relevant. Let me give you an example. If I was doing a survey on basically, let's go like nutritional facts for, you know, some of the snacks that people have in class, it wouldn't be a good source for me to ask the Department of Education about that, because they don't have specific data on that. You have to make sure that your source is tied to what your data is represented. So for our Boston example, if our source was, if it's talking about Boston skaters, but our source was figure skaters in some other city, that wouldn't really be relevant to us, and we wouldn't really trust that data. Okay, so look for source and make sure it's relevant. What conclusions can you draw from the table? We just did that. Okay, we looked at some of the intersections. We saw what beginners wearing no gear looked like. That was the intersection of that row and column. You can make calculations. With that, we did that by calculating the percentages. But another thing that I'm going to have you do is look for trends. So let's go back to our table here and look at some of the numbers in the table and see if we notice anything. So here, these numbers across the board, you'll notice it looks like for beginners, most of them, or the highest amount of them, are wearing one piece. Okay, a lot lower, no gear, and a little bit lower than the one piece is the 2 to 4 pieces. Okay, if we look at average, a lot more are wearing no gear. Okay, advanced, a lot more are wearing no gear. That should make sense because a lot of times as you increase your skill ability, you feel more safe to wear no gear or less gear. Okay, so those are some of the patterns you can look out for, and that will always be specific to whatever your variables are in your table. All right, let's flip it over the back and talk about this table. A little more going on here, but same kind of process. It says what variable is represented by the row headings. Okay, remind yourself that rows go across, okay, left and right. So left and right is over here, and it's talking about years, so that's got to be our age group. And it says, what kind of variable is it? So think about that. Remember, we have two types, categorical and numerical. Category is classified or grouped together, and your numerical represents a specific number. Okay? I hope you remember what I told you on the last one, is when you're an interval of values instead of a specific one, it's actually categorical. Again, the reason for that is we don't know how many 18-year-olds there are, how many 24-year-olds are. We're putting them all together, 18 to 24. So that's a grouping or a category, so categorical. Next one, what variable is represented by the column headings? Okay, I'll let you take care of that one. Go ahead, pause the video, write what you think, identify what type of variable it is. Okay, this one actually gives us the name of it. We don't have to figure out what it is. It's educational attainment. And for those of you who don't know, that's just defined as the highest level of education that someone has gotten to. Okay, so for me, I'm not going to fall in this category all the way up to here. I'm going to say my educational attainment is master's degree because that's the highest level. Even though I've already gotten all those other ones, okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means what was the highest level. Okay, let's go to some of the things that are given in the table before we answer some more specific questions. So it gives us the population 18 years and older. Notice it started at 18. It didn't start at all of them. Okay, and then it says it's classified by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin, and this data came from 2019. Okay, notice over here it said all races, so it's not actually segregating by that. It's grouping them all together and only looking at the years for this one. Okay, then below it says numbers are in thousands. That's important. Okay, so this doesn't represent 66, it represents 66,000. Okay, keep that in mind. Then it says these are civilians, so non-military, non-institutionalized population. So it's not counting everybody in the U.S. here, or it's counting just the people who are civilian and non-institutionalized. Okay, keep going to the bottom here. And let's look at some of the notes here. It says, plus armed forces living off post or with their families on post. So I said civilian is non-military. There is an exception to that right there. And then the second little note here, it says respondents who have completed 12th grade but did not receive a diploma are included in this category. So 12th grade here, notice up here, 11th grade, this little note too, is they included a little bit extra there. Now it says details may not sum to totals due to rounding. Remember what we talked about. If this number is in thousands, that says 66,000. That could have been 66,025, but they rounded it to the nearest thousand to represent it in this table to make it more easily read. Now down here it says the source is the U.S. Census Bureau. It came from a current population survey, and it's the 2019 Annual Social and Economic Supplement is where it's reported. Now that we know all of that, okay, let's go ahead and do some questions about it. Your first question actually says interpret a number in a sentence. Let me flash to that real quick. It says interpret the table entry 4,130 in a sentence. But I have some specific requirements here when we're talking about sentences. I want them to be specific. We've got all these details here. We want to make sure we're including the relevant ones. So backing it up, we're always going to start off our sentence with a source, if there is one. We're going to say, according to this source. That tells us our data is reliable and we're not just looking at data that's useless. We also want to be specific for the year. I actually usually end with the year, just because when we're making sentences, sometimes it flows better that way. And then we want to answer the question descriptively. We want to include a who, a what, a where, a how, anything that's relevant to the question. A lot of times this is answered by the intersections of those row and column headings. So let's take a look at this first example and we can kind of talk through what I mean here. So our first job is to go find this guy in the table. So what I want you to do is pause the video real quick and go find that and circle it. Okay, find it and circle it. Alright, here we are, 4,130, we found it, and when we're talking about context, what this means, we want to go up to the heading and over to the heading to talk about what it means. So, I told you that good sentences start with the source. That's at the bottom here, but sometimes, like I said, it's in the description of the table up above, so look out for that. If you do not have a source, you can just say according to the table. We're going to say according to the U.S. Census Bureau. We'll start there. Oops. And then throw in a comma. And then we're going to talk about this number. So this 4,130, first of all, is a number in thousands. So we want to either say the word thousands or we want to tack on 3 extra zeros. I like doing that because it's shorter than the word thousands. Okay? But also we want to say that it was rounded. Just like this 66,000 wasn't actually 66,000, it could have been 66,025. Same way this. Okay, we don't know if that's rounded or not, or, well, we know it's rounded. We don't know what that number specifically is. Okay, so we want to say approximately. But it's talking about those who were 70 to 74 and those who had their educational attainment being a high school graduate. So they didn't go higher than that. So we're going to say about, and you can use the approximation symbol instead of writing the word about. But we're going to remember to add the 3 zeros on the end. And then we're going to talk about the who, what, when, where, how. All that good stuff, okay? So, these are who? Okay, well, these are your civilian people. So, civilian, non-institutionalized, as it says. We want to be specific. Okay, and then let's go hit up our column and our row intersections. Okay, so these people were age 70 to 74, and they had a high school graduate, or high school graduate was their highest level of education. Okay, so we can say that in a couple different ways. I'm going to go ahead and start with age. So people aged 70 to 74 years. Make sure you get those labels on there. And then, since this was in 2019, I'm going to say had, past tense, had an educational attainment. That's what this thing was called. Of graduating high school. But we want to make sure, since I said had, we specify this was in 2019. Not necessarily true now. A lot of little details here. Now, what I am going to pay attention for is that you have the source, the year, the number, tell me whether it's approximate, adding thousands, and then those details like this and this. Okay, what I'm not going to judge you on is how you write it. Okay, so if you said those people age 70 to 74, highest level of education was high school graduate, great. Okay, you can word this in a little bit different way and it still means the same thing. Okay, just make sure your wording does mean what it's supposed to mean based on those headings. And this is kind of the more difficult example, which is why we're doing it together. It's got all these crazy details, and educational attainment is something that's kind of harder to put in words of what it's supposed to sound like. Okay, so if I say in a sentence describing its context or content, you need to write a good sentence with all these pieces. I'll take off if you don't. The next one, however, is a little bit different. It says interpret the entries for the column some, college, no degree. A lot of times I will say analyze the trends in the table or a specific column or a specific row. This one I still want you to write a sentence, but it doesn't have to include as many details there. Okay, so let's just check it out. It says look at the column some, college, no degree. Okay, so what I want you to do is pause the video, take a look at that column, and ask yourself, what's going on here? What do you notice? And then we'll talk about it here in a minute. Hopefully you saw that these guys were really pretty similar. Okay? They fall in the 2,000 to 3,000 range. This 4,000 is a little bit higher, not crazy higher, but then there's this first one. Whew! So much higher than all the rest of them. And in fact, that's actually the case for some of the other ones as well. Like if you'll notice this one, and this one's quite a bit higher as well. And I want to talk about why. We're supposed to interpret it. So if we think about the age group 18 to 24 years, why does it make sense that that age group has a lot more people who have some college but no degree than some of the other age groups? Think about 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, some 22-year-olds. You know, if you're going to a 4-year program, at that time in your life, you do have some college, but you haven't gotten old enough to graduate. So the age group (18 to 24 years) is much higher than the other groups. That's what we decided. Okay, but that's because that's the age they're entering college, if they're going to college. And that's not true for everyone, but it's just a generalization. Some other things we can look at while we're at this table, I want to point out if you look at this group. Okay, we talked about how the 18 to 24-year-olds, they were higher in some of those groups. I want to talk about the last group, the 75 and older. If you notice that the none is higher at the bottom for 1st through 4th, higher at the bottom through 5th, higher at the bottom here. All of these different groups, you know, it's pretty significantly higher. Now 11th grade, it looks pretty similar to some of these. Kind of go all over the place. But if you notice, we've got a large group for those who aren't finishing school. And the reason for that is if you think about the people who are age 75 years and older, when they were in 1st to 4th grade, 5th to 6th grade, 10th grade even, a lot of times there weren't schools past 8th grade. 8th was as high as you could go. Or if there were, or even before that, a lot of times kids would have to, especially in, you know, rural areas, they would have to quit school and, you know, help out with the family. So kind of different pieces of data we can gather just from looking at trends, multiple pieces of information in rows or columns. Alright, what I want you to do is pause the video and try this sentence. We talked about a sentence. Make sure you get the source first, the year somewhere, and then the who, what, when, where, how. Okay, answer the question based on this number you give me. Okay, pause the video. Take care of that. Make sure you're actually pausing the video and doing this, because this is what I take off points for. You have to make sure you get all of those important details in it. So check yourself here. Okay, get that done. Here's what my sentence looked like. Let me move this guy out of the way. According to U.S. Census Bureau, okay, you've got the source, says there were approximately, make sure you have the word approximately, about, or an approximation sign, because these numbers were rounded. They were to the nearest thousand. That gives me my next part here. You have to make sure you add the word thousands or 3 extra zeros. Okay, that's another thing I'm looking for. We've got the who, they're civilian, non-institutionalized people. And then we talked about those intersections, okay? Well, here, we're talking about the total, and we're talking about the 35 to 39-year-olds. Well, we don't need to say total people. You can just say people. If you want to add total, you can, but it's kind of already included there. But they were aged 35 to 39 years in 2019. Okay, not necessarily age that now. You got to include that year. So the details matter here. Make sure you're including all those pieces, and the more you practice here, we'll get the hang of it as well. All right, last question on our paper here. It says what percent, okay, remember what we said about percents. When you see the of, we're going to go there for the total. But it says what percent of 25 to 29-year-olds have at least a bachelor degree. So let's find this 25 through 29-year-old first. So that is this whole row here. And luckily for us, it gives us the total number. Already tallied there, so that's nice. If they don't give you the total value, which sometimes they don't, you just have to add all of these things up. And it did tell you on that note, remember that sometimes the sum doesn't add up quite right because of rounding. So that kind of says maybe if you add these by hand, it won't exactly be 23,277. Okay, but keep that in mind. That's where it's coming from. Okay, but now in that row, we're looking for at least a bachelor degree. So we're going to find bachelor's degree in terms of the columns. That's this one. But at least means bachelor's or more. Okay, so higher goes this way. So we want to take all of those. Just like with the protective gear, we have to add up the separate ones. So first up, 6823 plus 1803 plus 171. Oops. Let me get that number where it's showing. And then that last one was 221. And what you want to make sure of when you're typing this in your calculator is that you total that first part, the numerator there first, and then divide it. because if you just add it all together and then divide it, it's not going to quite work. So two options here, and I'll go ahead and walk you through this one. So 6823 plus 180, then plus 171 plus 221. Make sure you hit enter before you divide it by the next one. Oh, shoot darn, this was 1803. Okay, so I'm just going to subtract off that 180 and fix it. Add the 1803. Sorry about that. My pen died and didn't look right. Okay, so now we've got that total where we can divide it by that 23,277. Now remember, all of these numbers have 000 on the end, but for percents, because they both are rounded, you do not have to add those extra zeros. It will divide out to be the same percentage. Again, if percents are represented in the table, round to that decimal. If not, look for instructions or just round to whatever. Here we're going to just round to 2 decimal places like we have been. Let me go ahead and jot down that number. And say it's approximately 38.74. Label on this guy is percent. Okay. So on your homework, you're going to answer some questions about samples, populations, analyzing tables, writing sentences, things like that. But you might also see some other types of graphs, not just tables, so I wanted to show you a little bit of other things that you might see. Bar graphs are one example, and you've seen these before. Okay, it's got a title, and then we've got an axis label on the side and on the bottom here giving your variables, and kind of classifying what they are. It says you're using a bar graph when one variable is numerical and the other is categorical. The categories are going to go on the bottom, and then the numerical one is always going to go on the cross. So here it's talking about the income in thousands of dollars, and it represents those. Okay. Then you can also see a stacked bar graph. This one's talking about the different percentages of each group. It's the same representing the table that we saw on the first, but it says the frequency was converted to a percentage. Okay, so it took all of the beginners wearing, see the color coding, the 2 to 4 pieces, and divided that, made it into a percent. And so you can see how they're represented there. They stack to create 100% of all of the beginners, all of the average people, and all of the advanced people. So that will help you on your homework. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.